The transatlantic slave trade was a stain on humanity. Millions of Africans were ripped from their homes and families. They were packed onto ships like cargo. Disease was rampant. Death was commonplace. The suffering was unimaginable. By the late 18th century, Britain dominated this abhorrent trade. British ships carried millions of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. Profits from this trade fueled the British Empire. However, a growing movement began to challenge this evil. Abolitionists, fueled by morality and justice, condemned the slave trade. They publicized the horrors endured by enslaved Africans. They demanded an end to this barbaric practice. Their voices, though initially a minority, grew louder and more difficult to ignore. Parliament, facing mounting pressure, took a tentative step. In 1788, it passed the Slave Trade Act. This act, while not abolishing the trade, aimed to regulate it. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. The 1788 Slave Trade Act, also known as Dolben's Act, was a complex piece of legislation. Its primary goal was to improve conditions aboard slave ships. It aimed to reduce the horrific mortality rate of the Middle Passage. The Act introduced regulations on ventilation and sanitation. It limited the number of enslaved people a ship could carry. These limits were based on the vessel's tonnage. The Act also mandated the presence of a surgeon on board. However, the Act had a glaring flaw. It failed to define child. This omission had unintended consequences. Slave traders exploited this loophole. They crammed even more children onto ships. The suffering of the most vulnerable continued unabated. Children were particularly vulnerable in the slave trade. Small and easily controlled, they were seen as desirable commodities. Slave traders often targeted children. They were cheaper to purchase than adults. They took up less space on ships. The 1788 Act's failure to define child had tragic consequences. Children, some as young as 5 or 6, were crammed into ships. They endured the horrors of the Middle Passage alongside adults. Many died from disease, malnutrition, or despair. The plight of children illustrated the limitations of the 1788 Act. While well-intentioned, it failed to protect the most vulnerable. The Act's shortcomings fueled the abolitionist movement. The fight to end the slave trade in its entirety continued. Section 4. Breeding or buying, a debate ignited. The 1788 Act had another unintended consequence. It sparked a debate among slaveholders in the Americas. The Act's limitations on the number of enslaved people transported raised a crucial question. Was it more profitable to buy new slaves or to encourage breeding among existing ones? Some slaveholders argued for continued importation. They believed it was cheaper to buy new slaves than to raise children. They also saw new arrivals as more resistant to local diseases. Others favored breeding. They saw it as a way to create a self-sustaining workforce. They argued that raising children instilled loyalty and obedience. This debate revealed the cruelty at the heart of the slave system. Human beings were reduced to commodities. Their lives were measured in profit and loss. The 1788 Act, while aiming to regulate the trade, inadvertently exposed its inherent barbarity. Section 5. Regulating the ships, a glimmer of humanity. Despite its flaws, the 1788 Act did introduce some improvements. It mandated certain standards for slave ships. These regulations aimed to reduce the appalling death rate during the Middle Passage. Ships were required to have adequate ventilation. They had to carry a specified quantity of water and provisions. Surgeons were supposed to be on board to treat the sick. These measures, though minimal, represented a small step towards recognizing the humanity of enslaved Africans. However, enforcement was lax. Slave traders often flouted the regulations. The lure of profit often outweighed the fear of punishment. The 1788 Act, while introducing some improvements, ultimately failed to curb the worst excesses of the slave trade. Section 6. A stepping stone towards a world without slavery. The Slave Trade Act of 1788 was a pivotal moment in the fight against slavery. It was a flawed piece of legislation full of loopholes and compromises. It failed to protect the most vulnerable, and its enforcement was weak. However, the Act represented a significant shift. It acknowledged the horrors of the slave trade. It placed limits on the actions of slave traders. It gave abolitionists a platform to build upon. The 1788 Act was not the end of the struggle. It was a stepping stone. It paved the way for future legislation that would eventually abolish the slave trade in the British Empire. The fight for freedom and equality continued.